Okay, so your last lesson of the year, at least for this year, for Algebra 1, is chapter 10.5, which is about graphing radical functions. And luckily it has two things we've talked about. We've talked about domain. That is one thing you're going to be expected to do on your test. Domain of a radical function, if you remember, you might want to put that down, that domain is x. Remember, range was y. Domain means what values of x can you use. And the main thing you have to memorize is that negative values are not allowed inside. And again, that's the part you want to also understand, is negative values are not allowed inside of a radical. So whenever you're asked for the domain of any function, don't look at anything but the radical. So you find the radical, for example, on A. You find the radical which automatically tells me this is the most important part. This 2, not important. The y, not important. You ask yourself what is under the radical and notice that there is an x minus 3. And so if you remember how inequalities work, that means that x minus 3 cannot be negative. Cannot be negative if you think about all the numbers. So negative 3, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. It means that it can't be any of these numbers, but it can be 0 and it can go anywhere that direction, which means what you will say is that x minus 3 must be greater than or equal to 0. And that is the symbol you have to remember. Because you have to be 0 and higher, you cannot be any lower than 0. The symbol you use is that whatever is on the inside, so x minus 3 is on the inside, must be greater than or equal to 0. Then you simply solve it. So add 3 to both sides, and your domain is that x is greater than or equal to 3. That is it. That's all it takes. But again, you have to make sure you memorize that you look on the inside and that it can't be negative, so it has to be greater than or equal to 0. On B, again, the 3 isn't important. The 6 isn't important. What you are looking at is what's on the inside, so your statement would be, to start, the x plus 4 must be greater than or equal to 0. You then take that and solve it. I'm sorry, not equals, but must be greater than or equal to negative 4. Just to prove, because I almost forgot that part, because you always need proof, that you can't have a negative. If you were to take this function here, you notice that you have this domain right here. So if you were to take square root of, and it has to be greater than or equal to 3, so if I put a 3 minus 3 plus 2, notice that that gives me the answer of 2. If I were to put and change that to, using second enter, remember, if I were to change that 3 to a 4, it gives me an answer. If I were to turn that 4 to anything else, but as soon as I go lower than 3, like a 2, notice that it says it's a non-real answer, and it's a non-real answer because you cannot square root a number to get a negative. If you remember what we did for extraneous solutions, the negatives break these things. So again, you can't square root something. You can't square root a negative number, so that's impossible. But anyway, back to this. That would be your second domain. Again, your third one before we move to our graphing portion of this is pretty simple. Also, you simply look at the radical, look at what's under the radical, and say that whatever is under the radical must be greater than or equal to 0. So subtract 3, do your algebra, 2x is greater than or equal to negative 3, divide by 2. Again, I keep wanting to put equals, it's a bad habit I've always had. So your domain would be that x is greater than or equal to negative 3 halves. Alright, so again, that is what you're looking at. That's where you need to be. Once you get that down, you'll be okay. Graphing is a little more difficult, and I only say a little bit more difficult because it does require memory, and I know that we're in the last day of our lesson, which means that we've already been trying to, break down and be as quote-unquote lazy as we can possibly be. But this takes a little bit of memorization, and the memorization is from what we call the parent function here, which is y equals square root of x. The things you have to remember, and you might want to write these, is that your table of values is based off of 3 points. I don't know why I put 4 lines. 0 is a key point. The square root of 0 is 0. You really don't want to do this. Well, you can do it. You want the square root of 1. The square root of 1 is 1. But when you go to do the square root of 2, I would not use 2 under my x because the square root of 2 is a decimal. You don't want the square root of 3 because the square root of 3 is a decimal, but the square root of 4 is 2. And so the 3 numbers you want to look at is these. And I'm not saying you have to always type in those numbers, but what I am saying is that you want to memorize that that's the numbers for the parent function, because when you memorize that it's 0, 0, 1, 1, and 4, 2, That gives you your main 3 points that you will always use. And keep in mind that the square root function will never go back this way, so it's always going to start at 0, 0. It's going to make kind of a half parabola going this direction. So again, you want to memorize, the easiest way to do this is to memorize that you start at 0, 0, you go over 1 and up 1, and that you also go over 4 and up 2 because of that relationship. From there, you want to use what we did when we shifted parabolas. And when we shifted parabolas, we used this number here, which was on the outside, and the outside number, if you remember, was your y-intercept, which tells you that you go to up. And so you take your 0, 0, you move 2 up, and that would be this point. From there, you do the same rule. Over 1, up 1, over 1, 2, 3, 4, up 2. That is your graph. So again, it takes a little bit of memory, also a little bit of recollection from when we did parabolas, but again, I don't think it's hard if you really want to get that, and if you're working towards trying to get this good grade on a test. Absolute or square root of x minus 3, again, this is my y-intercept because it's on the outside, and this is telling me to go 3 down. Again, you might want to make sure you do that. So from here we go 1, 2, 3. From that original point or starting point, we go over 1, up 1. We start there, we go over 4, up 2. Remember, the relationship is because the square root of 1 is 1 and the square root of 4 is 2. You then draw your graph, and that's all. This was different. Remember that this is a opposite shift. If you remember doing that from before, what this is telling me to do, the plus 1 is with the x, so it affects x, but remember, if you will, that the plus 1 tells me not to go 1 right, but it tells me to go 1 left, because remember, we treat it like a negative 1. This is the one where you shift it and it tells you to go back 1. And just for proof, square root of x, x plus 1 is under, and then graph, and you'll see that it looks just like that, the graph that the graph we're about to do. So over 1, up 1, over 1, 2, 3, 4, up 2. Make sure you go over to the proper spots. Don't go over 1, up 1, then over 4 and all that. Make sure you go over 1, up 1, come back to your beginning, then over 4, up 2. If your 3 points on your graph or on your test are not in the right location, then you're going to miss it. So make sure you memorize where those 3 points go. If you're not sure where they go, come and talk to me. I'll be glad to help you out. Again, remember that this is the opposite shift, which means this negative 4 gets treated like a positive 4, which means go 4 right. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, I gave you something that can't be done. So you go over 1, up 1, over about 4, up 2. Your graph will look something like this. I don't know why I did that, but oh well. But that is your graph. And then you put it all together with this one, which is more like what you're going to see on your homework today, which is where you have to do both. Remember that this is my y, which tells me to go down 1. Remember that this gets shifted, which tells me to go back 2. There's your dot. Again, from that dot, over 1, up 1, over 1, 2, 3, 4, up 2. Draw your graph. Keep in mind that you should not touch that line above 2, because you wouldn't do that until you get 9 over. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you would need 2 more before you're actually at the third. But other than that, again, congratulations on making it through the year, or at least through the material. Now let's work on making it through the year. Make sure you work as hard as you can to prepare for this test, so that you can knock out this test and put yourself in the best position to pass and not have to come back here next year. Again, congratulations on your last lesson. Good luck.